Welcome everybody to this wonderful opportunity to have a Q&A with Ian Redmond OBE. I'm your moderator today, Vian Machon. I'm the Festival Director of the Regeneration International Youth Film Festival, and welcome everybody, and a huge welcome and thank you to Ian Redmond for being our Global Conservation Ambassador for the festival this year. Thank you, Ian, for being with us this evening, or well, actually your evening, my morning. I'm sure different times for everyone around the world.
My pleasure, Bjorn.
So Ian, you're a tropical field biologist and conservationist, and of course renowned for your work with great apes and elephants in particular, with more than 30 years associated with mountain gorillas, which is must be so exciting. I've got several questions. I've got several questions, but I'll have to hold myself back because there's a lot of people here to ask you questions. So you have a quote that I think is wonderful, and I want to ask you why. So, I am a naturalist by birth, a biologist by training, and a conservationist by necessity. So if you could start by just explaining that, and also how you came into this field of documentary making.
Okay, well, I think naturalists are born that way. I think all children have a fascination with their surroundings. That's what makes us human, our curiosity. And somehow during that growing up period, that curiosity about nature is either beaten out of you or you're encouraged to do other things because that's childish to be looking at tadpoles and caterpillars and watching birds. But some of us just keep doing it. And for whatever reason, I'm one of those. I'm fascinated by all life forms, from the big ones like the forest elephant behind me to the tiny ones like the little critters that live inside a forest elephant, the nematodes and cestodes. So life fascinates me, which is why I prefer to keep it general and call myself a biologist, because it's hard to make a living as a naturalist. But if you get an ology, then you've got a decent chance. So I was fortunate to go to Keele University in Staffordshire and did biology with geology. And geology I liked too when it was looking at paleontology, because just because the life forms are extinct, they're no less fascinating. It's harder to see their behavior, but you can infer a lot from fossils. And then I got the good fortune to go and work with Dian Fossey studying mountain gorillas in Central Africa, well, on the border of Rwanda and what was then Zaire and now the Democratic Republic of Congo. So that was an extraordinary opportunity, and I'm still involved in that because they don't tell you this when you go on a gorilla watching holiday, but gorillas are seriously addictive. And if you get to meet one on their home ground, not through the bars or the glass of a captive facility, it's very different. And I think you start to perceive other life forms and your own life form, humans, in a different way after encountering a being who is not human. Some people hear the word human being as if it is a word, but it's two words. And if there are human beings, you have to think of the possibility of non-human beings. And we're not talking about extraterrestrials from outer space. They may exist or might not. But here on Earth, we have many beings that are not human beings. And I had the good fortune to meet and get to know and become a friend to quite a number of gorilla beings. And these are the mountain gorillas of Rwanda. And you asked me how I got involved in filmmaking. Well, mountain gorillas are very photogenic. And when I went to Karasoke, the research center that Dian Fossey started in 1967, I got there in 1976. And before I left for Karasoke as a newly qualified biologist, but with no money, I went to a secondhand shop and bought this, which is a Bell & Howell Filmer 70. I mean, it was old when I bought it, but it is a wind-up clockwork cinema. Wow. But that's what professional filmmakers used, probably in the 40s and 50s. And because I bought it secondhand, it gave me the opportunity to film the mountain gorillas. But what I learned when I got to Karasoke was that access to gorillas at that time was largely controlled by National Geographic, which was supporting Dian's research. When I say access to the gorillas that were habituated, and that is that they didn't run away. They had learned to trust, first of all, Diane, and then others who were introduced by Diane or her colleagues, and I was one of those. So having that opportunity then to sit in a family of gorillas and not have them run away or attack you or behave other than just naturally was a very rare thing. Now, of course, since the advent of the mountain gorilla tourism, anyone who can afford the ticket can go and sit now 10 meters away from a family of gorillas, because we've extended that minimum distance. It is an aspirational minimum distance. You can explain it to the tourists, but you can't explain it to the gorillas. And so they sometimes break the rules and come closer. But you have the opportunity now, even just with a smartphone, to take lovely images of families of mountain gorillas. But in 1976, that was a rarity. And as well as shooting some material myself, which I recently found is likely to be in a documentary, and each time somebody finds something I shot, even if it was 40-something years ago, useful, it gives me a thrill because you hope your work's going to be useful and seen by people. But I also had the pleasure of helping other filmmakers who came to Karasoke to access that amazing and at that point unique interspecies opportunity where a filmmaker could come. And I mean, the best known of those, of course, was David Attenborough. This was before he was Sir David. He was just David Attenborough, and he was coming to make Life on Earth, which was the first of those huge BBC blue chip blockbuster natural history series. And he wanted a short sequence to talk about the opposable thumb and its importance in primate evolution and human evolution. But they chose gorillas, and his aim was to sit somewhere near some gorillas. He didn't realize how near it was going to be, and talk about this while seeing gorillas using their opposable thumb. And of course, what he didn't anticipate was Pablo, a juvenile gorilla, sitting in his lap, and Poppy, an infant gorilla, using her opposable thumb to undo his shoelaces. So
Yes.
It made television history at the time. It wasn't planned, and it almost wasn't filmed. And John Sparks, the producer, after it had been going on for a little while, said, "Oh, go on, shoot a few frames. It'll give the lads in the cutting room something to laugh at." But they included it in the program, and that is perhaps one of the best loved sequences of natural history television.
Absolutely. I was going to ask you about that, so thank you for bringing that in. What was it like for you in two moments? That moment must have been just amazing to have seen. Had you seen that sort of interaction before? And when you first engaged with, or well, first came close to your first gorilla, what was that like in your, in your heart and mind, that moment where you could actually look in another species' eyes like that?
Well, let's do the second question first. So the first gorilla I saw in the wild was Titus, who was then an infant being chased up a tree by his younger brother Quayle at the top of a tree over a thicket. And the chap who was introducing me to the gorillas was Diane's assistant, who I was replacing. He was a traveler called Tim White, and he wanted to carry on traveling. So he said, well, we go under here. And we crawled through this thicket, me, of course, draped in cameras and binoculars and bags, so being snagged and slowed down by the vegetation. But we emerged from under this thicket into a little glade with a family of gorillas relaxing, still back over there, snoozing in the sun, females here and here, some grooming, kids playing, the ones that were up the tree that I'd seen came down the tree and sort of wrestled in front of us. And it was just like joining a family picnic. It was delightful, except I wasn't there just to enjoy it. I had to learn to recognize the individual gorillas. So my notes from that day are full of tiny little sketches of me trying to work out the shape of the nostrils and the folds of the skin above the nostrils, which we known as nose prints. Like a fingerprint, they're unique to the individual. But of course, you can't go up with an ink pad and a piece of paper and get a nose print. It'd be very convenient if you could, but the gorillas wouldn't like that. So you sit with your binoculars trying to sketch. And okay, that's Titus, that's Quayle, that's Uncle Bert, that's Marcho, all the different gorilla names that they were identified by. Now, it's an interesting philosophical question whether gorillas have a concept of name. They know each other as individuals, and they certainly recognize individuals, because when they got to know humans, then they will behave differently when they see a human that they know again. But is that name or just kind of beingness? There isn't a label, as far as we know, that a vocal label that they put on each other, but they certainly know each other as individuals. And in any complex society, be it human or non-human, the way it works, the social rules apply according to who you are and who you're related to and who you're accepted by. So in a gorilla family, acceptance is denoted by someone during a rest period coming to sit near you. And just that proximity, relaxed, calm proximity, suggests that this is a friendship. And if that a gorilla chooses to do that, in those days, you were just sitting there taking notes. You didn't encourage it or discourage it. Now, of course, we try and maintain that distance because thousands of people every year are coming to see the gorillas. And as we're all aware after the pandemic, the possibility of someone bringing a pathogen to which the gorillas have no immunity is a real risk to them. So we do our utmost to prevent contact and to maintain a distance so that droplet infection can't reach the gorillas. In those days, so in the 70s, that was less a concern. We were kind of in permanent self-imposed quarantine up in the mountains, seeing very few other humans. So the risk of contagion was minimal. It existed, but it wasn't high in our minds. And so those close quarters encounters, which philosophically were wonderful, two species that for almost since they went on their separate evolutionary pathways have seen each other as enemies. Aggression, fear were the main reactions to one encountering the other. And thanks to Dian Fossey, winning their trust, learning the methods to reassure them and win their trust, now people can go and for those habituated families, have an experience which I think will reshape your view of the world and of humanity and of the other beings on our planet. And then how was it taking the BBC or other film crews to see them? What was then considered unthinkable, that you might be sitting next to a wild animal and he isn't going to tear you limb from limb or protect his or her children from you, the enemy, that just evaporates and you realize that you're in the presence of trusting beings. And that's what the magic is. That's why gorilla tourism is so successful. Not just because you can take a picture and show your friends, but because it's an extraordinary experience. And that the income from that tourism has been a large factor in the recovery of mountain gorillas, because it's funded the anti-poaching patrols and it's given the governments of Uganda and Rwanda and the DRC the motivation to ensure that the forests and the gorillas survive. So it is a rare conservation success story, and at intervals, different film crews have come and documented different aspects of that story, from sort of the mainstream media on television to Hollywood with Gorillas in the Mist, and other films have borrowed from that. And even in fantasy films like Avatar, you can see elements of the Karasoke story, the research center, the field scientists going out and studying the behavior, all kind of get woven into other movies as well. It's been quite an influential story, that study of mountain gorillas that Dian began and many others now continue.
So Ian, two things come up from that I really want to ask before I open up the rest of the questions. You mentioned about the concept of name, and of course Coco showed very clearly that she understood language. So one can assume that perhaps within their own, we just don't know yet, but within their own society, they may well have some sort of concept of name.
Yeah, I suspect they recognize each other's voices, but no one has yet demonstrated in the way that dolphins have what we call signature whistles, and which might in their minds be the equivalent of name. You hear a whistle, you know who it is immediately, because the peculiar sequence of sounds that is that individual dolphin signature. As far as we know, gorillas and Other apes don't have that. There's some suggestion from Joyce Poole's studies of elephants that elephants might know who it is and might even call out, not just where is everyone, but where are you, Betty, or the elephant equivalent. So that level of complexity is suspected in a few species, but it's very hard to demonstrate when you don't have the same vocal or cognitive apparatus. We think like humans. It's very hard to put your mind into an elephant's mind, particularly when you think an elephant has a brain nearly four times the size of a human brain, and equally complex in the folds and convoluted surface. So what's going on in there? Well, it may be that they're in touch with, dozens, if not hundreds of their clan, members of their clan, and that they are rumbling to each other in infrasound and keeping a track on where everyone is, which is why when someone kills an elephant over there, elephants miles away sometimes react. And the only explanation might be that there's some sort of panic call or fear call that is transmitted, and the thought now is that it's seismic, not just through the air but through the ground, and that those big pads that elephants walk on are sensitive to seismic vibrations of other elephants. It's an extraordinary concept. And how can we, with our puny little minds and our vocalizations that are only within certain frequencies, understand what's going on in infrasound, or in terms of bats, in ultrasound? We just have our little part of the spectrum that we hear, and these other species are saying who knows what to each other in sound waves that we can't even hear without machinery to either slow them down or speed them up.
Exactly. I'll save my other question for towards the end, though. We have a question about elephants. Regarding elephants, have you worked with primarily African elephants or also Indian elephants? And did anyone figure out why there were a group of elephants mysteriously migrating across China recently?
Oh, that's about 3 questions in one. I'm, as I mentioned earlier, fascinated by all life forms, and if they're large and socially complex, that's even more interesting. But I haven't studied Asian elephants. I've visited Asian elephants in the wild and in captivity, and seen attempts to reverse that process from captivity back into the wild, which we can talk about later, but that's a really important process in our current age. And the elephants that I studied in Africa were not actually true forest elephants like the guy behind me, who is an elephant known to hang around a research center in northern Congo, not the DRC, but Congo Brazzaville. He's known as Gentil because he is very kind and gentle. And he visits the park headquarters at Bumasa, which is where I took that photograph. But the elephants I studied from 1980 until the Ivory Wars in the mid to late 80s were the forest-dwelling elephants of Mount Elgon in Kenya. And at first I assumed, because they were in forest, that they were forest elephants, but I was corrected in that misapprehension. They are forest-dwelling savanna elephants, so Loxodonta africana. And now the two kinds of African elephant, forest and savanna, are recognized as full species, even though there are some parts of Africa where there's some hybridization between them. They are distinct in all sorts of anatomical and genetic ways. So the elephants I studied are unique because they have a unique culture of utilizing caves and going deep underground. And if you actually, I have the capacity, if I fiddle a little bit while we're talking, to go to a different background with, oh, there you go. There's one of the elephants that I studied. He was called Charles, and he's deep underground in a cave, tusking at the rock to eat lumps of it because it is mineral rich and he is salt hungry. Now the rock doesn't taste. Let's put that one. There's a line of forest elephants filing their way into the cave. Forest-dwelling elephants on Mount Elgon filing their way into the cave to mine. So what people were seeing as just caves into which elephants sometimes strayed. It turns out, from my results indicate that these are not just caves, they are elephant salt mines dug by generations of elephants over thousands of years, possibly tens of thousands of years, which is a unique phenomenon, although elephants digging into rock faces or into the ground to dig up minerals is commonplace wherever elephants are living, and the soils are leached of their mineral salts. So the plants growing in the soils are low in sodium, and the elephants and other herbivores are therefore salt hungry. And that appetite for salt is what drives its unusual behavior. But here, because the mineral-rich layer is capped by a flow of lava, which is cooled to form an impermeable and solid, strong roof. So usually if elephants are digging into a cliff, there'd be an overhang created, and then the cliff would collapse. And over many, many years, you'd get a slowly receding cliff. But on Elgin, the receding cliff is underneath a tough layer of lava. So it creates a cave, to the point where now this cave that you're looking at behind me is 160 meters from mouth to the deepest point. And the elephants go into the deepest point and tusk in total darkness. You can't see your hand or your trunk in front of your face, but you can feel your way if you've got a kind of built-in white cane sticking out your face. And they feel the way along, or the one in front feels, and the ones behind just keep in touch with the elephant in front. And they file into the cave and then spread out into these little mining bays and tusk that. And that was another story that I managed to get a number of film crews to come and document, with specialist equipment for filming in the dark. Yeah, exciting stuff.
Absolutely fascinating. So just the other part of that question was about the mysterious migration across China recently of some elephants.
Well, yes, who knows what was going on in the minds of those elephants, but wherever elephants live, almost everywhere that elephants live, their habitat is being fragmented by human use of the land, putting in roads and railways and pipelines, and that's the linear infrastructure. And then there's towns and cities and gardens, and then throughout what might be the countryside, now it's growing crops for humans. So there's very little land available for wide-ranging megafauna, such as elephants, that have large appetites and are themselves architects of the landscape, the way they shape the landscape, as you see the example behind me. You know, these caves are created by elephants, and the way they shape the forest, if they're in forest habitat. But Asian elephants are like mosaics of forest and grassland, so they can move in and out of them. And when they move from the forest to the grassland, their dung is full of seeds from the forest. And when they push over trees, they might create a clearing which becomes a grassland. So it's a shifting pattern. And when humans look at a land, they tend to think it's been like that forever, and will stay like that forever, which of course isn't true, particularly at a time of climate change. So as rainfall patterns change as a result of the average temperatures around the world going up, then vegetation will change. And if it weren't for all the human infrastructure, animals would move with the moving vegetation. But now, of course, there's fences and roads and railways that say, oh, no, you can't move this way because it's fenced off to stop you from walking on the rails and being hit by trains, or as happens in some parts of India, elephants do get hit by trains. So the big theme in conservation this decade is connectivity. It's particularly important under the conventional migratory species, which helps governments along the pathway or the flyway or the swimway of migratory species, depending on whether they're flying or walking or swimming. If they move from one country to another, or one country's territorial waters to another, clearly there needs to be collaboration if those species are going to be protected. And in doing so, their role in the habitats at either end of their migratory pathway can be protected. Because I think people sometimes forget in their urge to protect species that actually conservation is about conserving ecological processes. And if you don't have ecosystems doing what they do, then, well, basically we're stuffed, because the ecosystems are what keep the biosphere habitable, and we all live in the same biosphere. So we have to protect the animals to keep doing what they do to the ecosystems that produce the oxygen and the food and the fresh drinking water that every one of us on the planet depends on. And that doesn't so often come into the arguments about conserving elephants. Oh, we want to protect elephants because they're nice, and we want our children to go and see them in the future, both of which are true, but kind of not the important reason why elephants evolved, not to entertain humans and our children, but to play this role as ecosystem engineers and gardeners of the forest.
Very much so. Thank you. That was fascinating, Ian. A question from a young filmmaker. You mentioned how you almost missed the moment with the gorillas because it was unexpected. And I was wondering how you train your instincts to be able to know when to shoot or not.
Well, I think that depends how you get into filmmaking. If you start working in a studio, you know a lot about cameras and the technical side of it. But if you then move into natural history filmmaking, you might not know so much about the animals you're filming. So you're used to actors who perform on cue. And of course, animals very seldom perform on cue. So really, I don't think of myself as a photographer or a cinematographer. I think of myself as a biologist who sometimes holds a camera. And as a biologist, particularly with an interest in behavior, you're probably tuned into what the animal's likely to do next. And you probably have a sense of when to film and when not to film. And when I work with film crews, with proper cameramen who actually know what they're doing, I can say, all right, coming in from the left. And if the ideal shot for a cameraman is you're filming a scene and an animal walks into it, rather than what usually happens is that you start filming an animal and there's no intro, it's just there, but then you perhaps wait until it walks out of shot. My temptation is to follow the behavior rather than to think of the grammar of filmmaking, where you want nice little sequences you can stitch together. So sometimes my knowledge makes difficult films to edit for an editor. And I know nothing about editing, so they must curse me, because I just want to follow the behavior. I want to see what happens next. Sometimes that works. You know, I'm very proud of my most viewed video on my YouTube channel. Is called Gorilla Mums, and it's up at almost 30 million views. And that's because I followed the behavior, and the behavior is really interesting. And it's completely uncut, no editing there. It's as it happened, 2.5 minutes of perfectly normal gorilla behavior, but it's normal behavior that's normally hidden by leaves. And these gorillas were in a sanctuary in Cameroon. So their behavior was natural, but unnaturally, you could watch what was happening. And that just little subtleties of their behavior is so clear. And I think that's why millions of people have seen it and responded to it, because you just think, well, that's what we do. So that's not human behavior that I always thought it was. It's actually hominid behavior that we and the other apes share. And again, that kind of just changes slightly, perhaps, your understanding of humans and the other life forms on the planet.
Well, actually, that brings me to my own question. You are a friend and colleague of our international patron, Dr. Jane Goodall, and there's a very famous scene, of course, when the chimpanzee Wunda is released in Chimpunga Sanctuary, and after she gets out of the cage, she turns around and actually gives Jane a hug. And that's just such an incredibly emotional moment.
It is very moving, isn't
it? It is. It's just incredible, because you just see that, you see in Wunda's face the gratitude. You actually see in her face this incredible sense of gratitude as she holds Jane and even gives her a little pat on the shoulder. Very human behavior, but that was just incredible. Have you ever had a direct contact like that unexpectedly with any of the gorillas?
Well, I mean, that's a curious instance, because it wasn't that Jane had been involved for years looking after that ape.
No.
But she was involved in the release. And Jane is a very empathic person. And I think Wunda sensed that. And we don't know whether she understood that Jane's presence was in some way connected with her release. But there was clearly a contact there. And it's that, when you see that communication, that I think it breaks down the barriers. It doesn't, whether you're talking about different tribes or races of human, different cultures, when communication starts, things get better and mutual understanding follows. So that little bit of mutual understanding, which was self-evident, you didn't need a voiceover saying, and now the chimpanzee is, you can see it. And that's the same with gorilla mums. You don't need a voiceover. You don't need music to tell you when to feel emotional. You just look and it's self-evident. So I think that's what a filmmaker hopes to get. And full marks to whoever was recording that, because they could have just expected the chimp to walk away and be pointing the camera the wrong way, but they managed to get that scene. So it's from a filmmaking point of view, trying to anticipate what might happen with unpredictable beings. You know what they say about never work with children or animals, because they're unpredictable and they'll likely upstage you if you're an actor. So you have to kind of carry that in your mind, and anticipate things that might happen. And very often you'll be pointing your camera the wrong way when it's happening over there, which is frustrating, but you do it often enough and you'll get something right. Taye, you've got a hand up.
Tay, yes.
Yes. Honestly, and listening to you is just like a masterclass. So I'm just taking notes. I'm just writing and doing all kinds of things. So thank you for granting this moment once again. I just wanted to ask you. I'm deviating from the elephant. Because I've seen a lot of your videos on elephants, but that's not enough though. But I just wanted to ask you a particular question that there was an interview you granted just a couple of weeks or a month ago, and you mentioned, and I'm quoting you, "We are not going to solve climate crisis without solving biodiversity crisis," and this is with the awakening of COP27, and I guess that was COP19 you were on or something like that. I just wanted to know, I mean, we've had conversation passively with regards to some of this biodiversity conversation, but I just wanted to know more about what you meant by that, because the world is actually looking at the climate crisis right now, but nobody's focusing on the biodiversity crisis. And
well, not quite nobody, because as we speak in Montreal, representatives of every country on earth are trying to hammer out the unfortunately named post-2020 global biodiversity framework. Snappy, just trips off the tongue, doesn't it? But which is a sort of it's also been described as a new deal for nature. It's the policy that should guide government policies around the world to halt the loss in biodiversity. And I don't like the word biodiversity. When you break it down, bio, life, diversity, it's self-evident, but it's too many syllables for most people and it's not immediately apparent. So we're talking about the destruction of nature and what used to be described as the web of life, the interconnectedness of all organisms. But biodiversity seems to be all about lists. How many species are there? How many species used to be? Oh, there are fewer now. That's bad. As if it's just a list. And it's almost like the species are stamps in a stamp album, and it would be a shame to lose some of them because then we wouldn't have a full set, rather than the species are components in an ecosystem, and those ecosystems are the life support mechanism of our spacecraft. Because if you think of the Earth, it's a ball of rock, that's not habitable. It's only the thin bit on the outside of air and water that is the biosphere. Again, bio-life sphere, but it's only very thin. If you look at the Earth from space, it's tiny, and we live in there. And what I think has not fully got through to the decision makers, although it's getting there, is that the processes that go on in the biosphere are essential to all of us. I just commented on an article which is really good about how the World Bank and other institutions are helping fund biodiversity conservation and talking about natural capital and how if you value nature and the ecosystem services it provides, it can actually transform the economy of poor countries. And all the focus of this article was on poor countries, developing countries. And I'm thinking, hang on a second, people in the developed world need oxygen and fresh water and food to eat, all of which comes from nature. So it's sort of at the bottom of most governments' priorities. You've got to look after the health of the population, the education of the population, the transport systems, the trade, the defense. All those are the big budget ministries. And then somewhere around the bottom, there's environment, because nature's nice and we want to have somewhere to walk in the countryside on a weekend, rather forgetting the fact that it's nature that supports all those other activities, and that rather than being at the bottom, it's the foundation, which is at the bottom, but it supports everything else. And that's, I think, what we're not seeing in the minds of the corporate and political leaders. And that's partly because the press doesn't report it. And particularly in democratically elected leaderships, they listen to what the voters say. And if all the press report about is climate change and hardly ever mention biodiversity, except as a kind of a nice nature story, or some serious destruction of nature where some company's done something bad, but the consequences of that destruction, it seems, are not fully elaborated and understood. So I think we need to see more of that understanding of the interconnectedness. If we destroy nature, it certainly scuppers our chances of solving the climate crisis, and the climate crisis will exacerbate the destruction of nature, because these changes in temperature and rainfall patterns will have consequences. And I think what's beginning to happen is that the value of the services provided by the ecosystems are being calculated. And if the corporations of the world start to pay for those services, as they do for any other service, they hire an accountant, they expect to pay the accountant to get the accounts done. They hire a lawyer for whatever function the lawyers play. They don't at the moment hire elephants or whales or orangutans or other species who play the role of keystone species in their ecosystem. And those ecosystems are central to life on Earth as we know it. And they're also essential for sequestering and storing carbon. At the moment, over most of the world, the only ecosystem service that is valued in financial terms is the carbon sequestration. But I'm part of an initiative called Rebalance Earth. Rebalance.earth is the website. And starting with forest elephants, we're hoping to translate the calculation of the value of their daily work that they do just by being elephants in their natural habitat into money that companies will pay to balance their carbon budget and to a greater extent their ecological footprint. And companies are now calculating their ecological footprint, and the more thoughtful companies with a view to the future are aiming not just to reduce their negative impact on nature, but to become net positive, to have a positive impact on nature and try and restore some of the damage. So the UN has declared this decade the decade of ecosystem restoration. And it really is up to all of us to think about that and see how we can enact it in our own backyards or our own schoolyards or our own common land. And many people think, oh, plant trees. Of course, before humans were planting trees, most trees were either dispersed by animals or by wind. And the wind dispersed seedlings that land in our vegetable beds, we think of as weeds and hoik them out. But if, as well as hoiking them out, we then perhaps put them in a pot and put them somewhere we do want trees, we can help restore tree cover to wherever you live in the world, assuming it's a habitat with trees. So I think that there is a lot that the individual can do to try and reverse this trend of nature destruction, because it's very clear that we cannot live without nature. Nature can do fine without us. And in fact, in many respects, nature would do better without us than with us, given that we're so destructive in our current culture and industrial society. And I think it's the role of the filmmakers to tell that story and to tell the story of each individual around the world who is trying to reverse that destruction of nature in their habitat, and show the things that work, and also, more importantly, show the things that you thought were going to work but didn't work. Because if we don't tell people about our mistakes, they're very likely to make the same mistakes. So I think filmmaking has a huge role to play, and that's why I'm excited that these film festivals are happening and encouraging young filmmakers. And we have this new phenomenon called eco-flicks, which is like Netflix, but for the environment, where all the proceeds, all the subscriptions, if you sign up, go to saving animals and the planet. And, you know, we hope that that can be part of the solution to join this global effort to reverse the loss of nature and restore ecosystems so that we and our children and their children can have a decent planet to live on.
Sorry, I just have a follow-up question. Sorry, Vian, to I'm not taking over your moderation. I just
That's okay, no worries.
I just wanted to. I was having a conversation with a climate expert, an environmental expert from Kenya, and that was right after our festival, and they were, you know, going to Egypt, and I said, you know, just for curiosity, were those on your list? And he mentioned some of them who have participated previously. I mean, I've been in COP 26 25 with them, and, you know, have different conversation with regards to climate. And I said, you know, these are the same people who went to COP 25 in Paris and, you know, Glasgow, and now in Egypt. Don't you have someone else? Don't you have someone else who can talk about climate in those spaces? And his question is, these are experts. So I said, listen, the year 2022, Kenya has just elected a new president, and, you know, from the statistics, 1.6 million 20-year-old voted in this election. Guess what? And he said, what? And I said, 10 years ago, this 20-year-old were 10 years old. They know nothing about anything. Can you imagine if you had, you know, speak about climate to them in a way that concerns them? Do you know you'll be having someone else to go to Cairo with you, especially because this is happening in Africa, and, you know, whatever. So he said, oh, that's interesting. I didn't see it like that, but it's very interesting about what it just connects to what you mentioned about storytelling. I think the more what we feed our children is what they become. And, you know, we don't have so many platforms like this. And hence the reason why when you shared, you know, the posts, I quickly follow up on Vian. I'm like, this is amazing, because, I'm really thrilled by what you're doing, especially catching them young. And one of the things that we were thrilled about our festival this year is that we had more students attended as well, because we do believe that the future is now. We can only teach about the future now. And so I'm just, this is more of a statement, but the question is, how do you think we can do more? How do we think we can, there are so many subjects that I personally feel they're not important in schools anymore, especially the primary education. How can we put climate into it? Is that something that you've discussed in any of your forums, spaces ever? Over to you.
Very much so, yes. EcoFlix, although it's a subscription service for the public, it's free to schools. And it's free to schools for that very reason. We want teachers to have a free educational resource that can inform children about the importance of these issues. But you make a very good point about the people who go to these COPs. And for people listening to this who aren't familiar with, COP stands for Conference of the Parties. And the parties are governments that have signed a convention. And each of the UN conventions has a different series of COPs, which is why you have this weird situation of COP27 in Egypt being followed a couple of weeks later by COP15 in Montreal. It should have been in Kunming in China, but because of the Chinese COVID policies, they couldn't host it there. So it's being hosted in Canada with China as the presidency of the COP. And the Conference of the Parties is the highest decision-making body of a convention. And the Convention on Biodiversity, which is one that's meeting now in Montreal, is supposed to develop policies that will protect life on Earth, biodiversity, the diversity of life. And it's been very hard because it involves those who want to exploit nature and those who want to protect it. And those who want to do both, sort of protect it, but exploit it a bit. And where do you draw the lines, and how do you share the benefits that derive from nature and give access to those benefits to all the people involved? And very often the people involved are the indigenous people and local communities living in the habitat or next to the habitat, who live a very long way from the capital city, where the elite are governing the country. So that you've got the least politically powerful people, who are the stewards of nature, very seldom being represented at government level in these talks between nations to decide how to protect nature. So, and then within government, as you say, the same people who go to the climate COP are in probably the Ministry of the Environment, or maybe some countries have a minister specifically for climate, but they're not necessarily the minister that deals with wildlife. In Kenya, because of the success of your tourism, the minister responsible for wildlife is the Minister of Tourism. And so the value that you see of an elephant in Kenya is that foreigners from around the world, and indeed better off Kenyans, can spend their spare time going on safari and looking at the elephants. So it's the kind of ornamental value of elephants. Very few people think of elephants as a climate issue. And yet elephants play such an important role in the sequestration and storage of carbon in ecosystems. In savannas, it seems that it's the soil carbon that is increased when there are elephants. And in forests, it's the above ground carbon. And in some forests, also the soil carbon. If it's a peat swamp forest, you've got deep peat, which is stored there for thousands of years because of the ecosystem on top of it, in which forest elephants and other species, obviously the great apes in Africa, the chimpanzees and gorillas and bonobos, and in Southeast Asia, the orangutans and the smaller apes, the gibbons and siamangs, are all busy dispersing seeds and pruning the trees and making the forest more efficient. And one of the responses that the climate ministers are saying to climate change is we need to plant more trees, as if that's all humans going out and digging a hole and putting a seedling in. That doesn't always work, because if you don't water the tree, it'll die. So we need to grow more trees, but there isn't enough land available that isn't being used for agriculture or cities to plant all these billions of trees that people say we have to plant. So what we need to think about is, how do we make the trees we've got more efficient? That's where the elephants come in, because a study in Central Africa showed that a forest with forest elephants has about 7% more above ground biomass than a forest where they've been extirpated by ivory poachers years ago. So if you can make every forest that previously had elephants in them more efficient by adding the elephants back into the system, then you're increasing the capacity of those forests to take in CO2, release oxygen, and store the carbon. And that's what we need to happen. Likewise, in the seas, the whales do that. All the marine mammals are fertilizing the phytoplankton, the little organisms that photosynthesize, take in carbon dioxide, release oxygen, and store the carbon. So these large animals are really important. But you show me an article that I haven't written, which talks about the ivory trade in terms of its impact on the climate. The connection isn't there. So when we as filmmakers, and in this context, I'm lumping myself with you, although I don't call myself a filmmaker, I help make films, but it's our job not just to educate the kids, but to educate the ministers. Say, look, I know you've got this portfolio and this is your responsibility, but you have to be aware of the importance of elephants, not just for tourism, but for making Kenya or any other country's ecosystems more efficient. And there are 50 countries in the world with elephant populations. There used to be a few more, but they're extirpated there. And some of the countries with elephants are down to a handful, a few dozen or a few hundred or a few thousand. So the reality is, just specifically looking at elephants, we think we've lost 96% or more of the elephants that used to be the mega gardeners of the forest. 96%. How are we going to rebuild those ecosystems if we're still killing elephants for fun, through sport hunting, for poaching for ivory, for crop raiding? You know, when somebody loses crops to an elephant, I really understand that is their livelihood gone. But if they were being paid for the ecosystem services provided by that elephant, they might be a bit more tolerant. They might be able to afford an electric fence to keep the elephant out of the crops. And that's the kind of thinking which I think is going to turn around this decline in elephant numbers and other important keystone species, to allow them to recover, to make their ecosystems more efficient, so that not only do we halt biodiversity loss, we help to stop the climate change as well. Sorry, you got into here's a rich seam of thoughts there. So, but are any of the other participants keen to ask a question more about filmmaking rather than ecology?
Yes. Well, I was going to say, Ian, you've very generously given us more time than we had asked for. So, are there any final questions before we wrap up?
Well, yeah, hi, it's Dan from the Los Angeles Children's Film Festival. You kind of touched on it a few times, but what would you recommend? And I guess this is a filmmaking question, but so all of our festivals have young filmmakers, and many of them are interested in documentary filmmaking. What would you recommend as far as, you know, what they should think about first, and story structure especially? Should we look at the kind of stories that you're talking about as traditional story, or is it kind of thinking outside the box maybe?
Well, as you've just seen from my thought processes, there are many interlocking stories, and it's hard to, hard to keep focused. If you try in a short film, weave in all the things that we've been bouncing ideas about here, you might confuse the audience. So I think trying to keep focused on the point you want the audience to go home with at the end of the film. Obviously, you want to entertain them, and ideally, you want to give them hope. So, well, the philosophy we have on Ecoflix is we don't show a problem without showing a solution. Of course, it's important to people to understand how serious the problems are, but it's depressing just to have a long list of problems. You also need to show who's doing what to solve the problems and where it's working. And in some places, it really is working. So try and end on a this is what you can do next note, and you empower people. And I think that's something that filmmakers can really do, because if you watch a documentary that's well crafted, when you get to the end, you've been moved. Your emotions have been stirred by this powerful story and the events, which might have been tragic, and you kind of hope you're not going to leave people in a, that was awful, what can we do? Let's give up, go home. But more, that was awful, but we can do something about that. We, not they have to do something, we have to do something. And I think that is a powerful thing. I think when filming animals, an important thing, and this is just sort of sprang into my mind as you were talking, is to try and consider the eye line. So whether you're filming ants or elephants, you kind of want to be on the same level so that you see the world from their perspective. And that often means not looking down on ants or small animals on the ground, but get your camera down. And I was saying this, whether you're just using your smartphone and filming with limited equipment, and some very powerful and moving and telling documentaries have been made on a smartphone. These days, you don't need to have huge editing suites and millions of pounds worth of studio time and equipment and personnel. If the story is there and you've got the images, you know, you can always weave that together in your bedroom, and because everyone can publish now online, if it has merit, people will notice, and you'll get views. And then at some point, somebody else is going to notice and say, hey, this person is talented. He or she should come and talk to us, and maybe we'll give them a bit of better kit and they can tell the story better. Now, David Attenborough has responded to this question about equipment with the fact that when he started in the 50s, they were using very basic cameras with black and white film. And people were entranced by what they saw, because what they saw was new and the films told a story. And then it went through introduction of color and then digital, and now these incredibly high definition cameras and drones and everything. They add different viewpoints, but don't get carried away by the technology, because the technology has to help you tell the story. And the story is what will grab people's imaginations. And I'm just urging you, when you've got a powerful, emotive story to tell, the moment when that film finishes is the most precious moment. That's where you need to present a solution. You need to engage someone. And that's what we try and do on EcoFlix. You know, if you enjoyed that, if it moves you, here's the organization you can support. Here's how you can get involved locally. Here's how you can change your own behavior if you want to avoid that. If it's a film about plastic pollution, you know, we can all stop chucking plastic bottles out of the car as we drive down the motorway, if indeed we have a car and a motorway at hand. But we can all try and reduce our personal footprint on the planet. And I think that's something that the filmmakers, without being preachy, just kind of show how small changes times millions of people can do a lot of good in the world.
Absolutely. And thank you, Ian. That's exactly what the Regeneration International Youth Film Festival is all about. It's about giving voice to young people for creating that resilience and empowerment in this current generation that are facing greater challenges than any other generation before them. And as the festival director, I was looking for very unique content particularly from young and emerging filmmakers. And what I found during my search is that there was some absolutely fabulous films, but they were very dystopian. And my concern is that we want our young people to feel the what's right about the world, not just what's wrong about the world. And so our philosophy at the School Broadcasting Network is very much about, as we think, so we create. And by using this very powerful medium of film to reach the hearts and minds of global communities through the young creators of today's, which they're going to become the professional writers, directors, producers, cinematographers of tomorrow. They have a very significant responsibility to really guide the narrative in a positive direction. And that in itself will grow the film industry into new ways, leading change in a seriously, you know, we're doing a lot of dystopian content right now, and the more we focus on the dystopia, the more we create dystopia around us, because that's just the natural way. The more we think about something in a negative, the more we create negativity, and the more we think about something in the positive, the more we create a positive outcome. So what we need to be doing now is nourishing those hearts, minds, and spirits of the self-knowing human that we are evolving into now. And our next generation of filmmakers and media professionals need to come to understand that, as I think, so I create, because then they can then be the absolute tour de force to usher in a new creativity that is for the betterment of humanity and our planet. And that's exactly what I get EcoFlix is all about. That's what we are about with the Regeneration International Film Festival. So we've taken a lot of your time, Ian. I want to say thank you so much for being such a guiding light and such a generous person in the way that you offer your wisdom and knowledge to the world. And hopefully everything you've said here today, I'm sure everyone's going to take away some really great messages as filmmakers. And there is a comment here coming up. We'll hand it over to Dana. As a young filmmaker, can you unmute yourself, Dana?
Hello.
Hi, Dana.
Hey.
That was really inspiring. I don't have any questions to add, but just thank you so much for everything that you said. Yeah, I found it to be very thought-provoking.
And what will
Well-
you take away from that, Dana, as a filmmaker?
Pretty much everything. Sorry, I'm having a hard time summing it up, but yeah, just the intentionality, I think, and the awareness that is so key in terms of kind of this area.
Yes, and the thing I think that really important is for, as you just said there, Ian, if you can end on that positive note where no matter how dire the content that you've covered in your, whether it be a documentary full length or a short or 2-minute film, whatever it might be, if you can wrap up that with hope, with some source of solution. So solution-based media is what we need so desperately now, because that, if there's a wave of dystopian, attitudes and depression and sorrow for where we are on the planet right now, and we need to move through that into where the ray of hope is, by seeing and being motivated by those who are achieving incredible things, because there are so many incredible things that are being achieved that are the pathways through these difficult times. And the more that our young filmmakers can seize on those opportunities and create more of that, the wave, that sort of point of 100th monkey syndrome comes in. There's a critical mass where you have enough of it for enough people to go, oh, I get that, I can do that too. And so that's really what our festival is about, is to bring together those beautiful films that are showing exactly that. And it could be just in a very simply creative, animated way, something that's very joyful, that it touches your heart and it uplifts the spirit, and you feel refreshed for the new day, that I can do this, I can make change, simple things that I can do, or I can just show a simple act of kindness, anything that will make a difference in your own life, in your own sphere of influence. And Ian, you've certainly been a guiding light for decades in all that you do for conservation, for the planet, and we are very grateful that you are our global ambassador for the Regeneration International Youth Film Festival, and we thank you for your time, and now quite late this evening in the UK.
Well, it's a pleasure to chat with you all. I'm sure that you could all teach me just as much as I could teach you, particularly about filmmaking and how to use modern equipment. But it just occurred to me that one of the ways in which some of the films in the festival might be helpful is that schools traditionally have an assembly at the beginning of each day, or at least once a week, where important things are discussed. And whether it's a religious school and you sing hymns and have prayers together, or whether it's a more secular school where it's just discussing issues of the day. But the sort of short films that you're making for this festival would, to my mind, be ideal films to show in an assembly at school, and then have the filmmakers and perhaps other staff or pupils with an interest discuss it. So I just throw that out there, because
what a great idea.
Films
Absolutely.
aren't just for film festivals, they're for other uses too. And putting them on a screen in front of the school would not only get some recognition to the filmmakers, and that would be useful and perhaps inspire other filmmakers in the school, but the topic that you've covered could then be discussed as part of the school's education program. Schools have a responsibility to create good citizens, and I think filmmaking could be an important part in that. I just throw that idea out there.
Absolutely, what a brilliant idea. And we did have, I think, a comment from Dan as well, Dan, from LA.
No, I was applauding.
Oh, you were applauding.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
But Ian's answer to my question was perfect about how young filmmakers, because some of them, we get filmmakers as young as 5 years old who are starting to think about documentaries already and even making them, which is really astonishing. And so I think it's important not to forget about educating the younger filmmakers, you know, with the basics of storytelling and documentary, as well as traditional narrative structure. So
Exactly.
And
And the
with the social media platforms now, I recently learned that TikTok is not just about dance routines. You know, short form videos can keep you occupied for hours, but important messages can be conveyed to a remarkable number of people around the world on a social media platform that people think is just about showing everyone what you had for breakfast or what gossip you're interested in. There are really serious little nuggets of film circulating on TikTok and Instagram and other platforms. Yeah, I never expected I would have a TikTok account. It's very small and I'm just beginning. And I haven't yet been tempted to do a dance routine, but I will put up interesting animal behavior videos or other things. And I think that's the younger filmmakers are far more aware of these possibilities than I am. Which is why I say you could teach me an awful lot about the filmmaking in the 21st century rather than 50 years ago when I first got involved.
And I think what Tay said earlier as well, if, you know, it's where we can engage people as young as 5, as Dan just mentioned, with this information by the time they do become the new filmmakers in their, you know, in their early 20s, they've already gained 10 or more years of understanding of this. And so we really, you know, reaching young filmmakers as young as 5, 6, 7, 8 with all of these concepts, that's where I feel very hopeful that they can take that inspiration and be the new wave of that, as I said, that new tour de force for positive change within cinematography, so that we have a lot more films that bring us feelings of that we can do this. There is hope. There are successful stories, and a little less of the dystopian what's wrong with the world, because we all know what's wrong with the world. Now we need to be able to inspire young people to be those leaders for change.
It's a very encouraging thought to end on. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Ian. We are very, very grateful, and this has been a totally inspiring, what turned out to be an hour now. So thank you very much for your time, and we say thank you to all of the viewers that will be seeing this on demand a little later. So we hope that you will all take away some really great messages from this event, and thank you to all the participants today for your interesting questions.
Yes, thank you. Good luck in editing it too. Trying to bring it down to a reasonable length.
yeah, it'll be fine. Thank you, Ian, so much. Very good. Very
Okay.
nice.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you everybody for having me.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.